what the party has to be careful of is not to become that quintessential establishment unit that nobody pays attention to.
I'm Eric Wilson, managing partner of Startup Caucus, the home of campaign tech innovation on the right. Welcome to the Business of Politics show. On this podcast, you're joining in on a conversation with entrepreneurs, operatives, and experts who make professional politics happen. This episode is all about the Republican National Committee, the RNC, what it is, who's on the committee, and the organization's role within the broader Republican Party. To help us understand and unpack the RNC, we're joined by Saul Anuzis, principal and managing partner of Coast to Coast Strategies and president of the 60 Plus Association, the conservative alternative to ARP. He was chairman of the Michigan Republican Party from 2005 to 2009. He ran for chairman of the RNC in 2009 and 2011. He also served as Michigan's national committeeman. So he has tons of valuable insight into the inner workings of the party. Saul, let's start with a simple question that I know has a complex answer. Is the Republican National Committee the Republican Party?
Well, I guess the simple answer would be yes and no. It is representative of the Republican Party in the sense that obviously it is the national organ that most people are aware of. The national chairman is normally the spokesman that most media personalities go to for a comment. But at the same time, the Republican Party is a very grassroots organization that is made up of parties in all 50 states and all the territories, as well as the District of Columbia. So it is a very broad-based representation of where Republicans come from. But the party itself has, there's a separate party in all 3,600 and some counties across the country. There are Republican clubs that, whether it's a women's club or the college Republicans or the young Republicans, that are also representative. So it's a little bit simplistic to say that it is necessarily the Republican Party, but it is clearly the representation of the Republican Party and what most people nationally would consider the Republican Party.
And Saul, in the first conversation I have with most entrepreneurs or technologists who are looking at the Republican Party, they say, I want to put my skills to use. I've got an idea for a startup to help Republicans win. They come to me and say, hey, I just need to get a meeting with the RNC, and then they can make every Republican candidate PAC in the country start using our software, right? And that's the way we're going to do it. And then I have to sort of walk them back from that, because it is much more complicated, as you allude to. And similarly, from folks who are more in the donor space, I'll say, well, we're building campaign technology to help Republicans win. And they'll say, oh, well, doesn't the RNC do that? And yes, they do to some extent, but also the broader applications. And so I think it's important for people to understand the RNC's role versus what does the Republican Party mean. Similarly, I know you and I both do work internationally. A lot of people think that the Republican National Committee is sort of like the party as it is in other countries, and that's just not how we work.
Yeah, and I think it's important to understand, we truly are a very entrepreneurial party. So virtually every state party in the country has its own ability and interest in being better than the party next door. And so there's a lot of technology that normally starts at the state party level versus a Republican National Committee level, and slowly moves itself up to where it becomes kind of acceptable software or technology that people can go to and say, look, here's a great service that started in Michigan or started in Florida or whatever, and is recommended to be used around the country. But in very rare cases, does the Republican National Committee kind of anoint, or approve a software or technology that is then ubiquitously used throughout the state party organs across the country. You also have to be aware that, some of the most effective and influential organizations within the Republican Party are, for instance, the Republican National Governors Association, or the National Republican Senatorial Committee, or the National Republican Congressional Campaign Committee. These are electoral arms of the various legislative bodies and executive bodies across the country that have sometimes as much or even more money that is directly spent on campaign technology and interest to elect their members. So, somebody who is interested in getting their technology or their ideas into the kind of party apparatus, you really have a lot of venues and a lot of avenues in which you could take to get kind of proof of concept before it became accepted or even known by the broader Republican audience.
What are some of the main responsibilities of the RNC within that broader network?
Well, the RNC is the only organization legally that is capable of coordinating campaign activities with independent committees, campaigns, county parties, state parties, etc. So there's a lot of state and federal laws that prohibit kind of the third-party spending and third-party coordination. And the one area that usually has an exception in all that is the party, so to speak. So from a legal perspective, probably the most powerful role they play is they can often coordinate activities, coordinate assets, coordinate campaign efforts that other people can't put together in that way, or at least not legally. And so that's probably the number one role they play. Number two, it's probably the leading fundraising arm because it does have a national reach. Many people don't know the difference. They don't know that there are other groups available where they could give more directly to something they're more passionate about. Like the Republican Governors Association is probably one of the strongest and biggest national organizations and elects Republican governors, where today we have a majority of Republican governors in this country. And they have a very robust, major donor group where a lot of people join that for networking purposes, and you're dealing with executives. And there are a lot of technology and a lot of opportunities from a software perspective are state of, the states themselves, right? So these governors are looking at a better way to provide social services. They're looking for a better way to run their DMB for getting license plates and managing those type of things. So, you really have a unique opportunity in that regard, where whether it's from prisons to social services to car registrations to anything else that the state governments are involved in, there the governors have a greater role, or the Republican State Legislative Conference, which is like state legislative leaders. Then again, if you're dealing on the congressional front, the Senatorial Committee has their group, the Congressional Club has their group. So there's really a lot of venues for an entrepreneur or for somebody who's looking to get into kind of the Republican space on how to enter it. It's not just the RNC. And I would almost argue that it's probably easier to go to other venues that have a much more entrepreneurial approach than the RNC, which has to be friendly and has to be kind of the overwhelming, overbearing, big government type of role of taking care of everybody underneath that umbrella.
Yeah, and listeners will remember from our campaign finance explainer episode, we talked about some of the special carve-outs that the RNC has in terms of limits and coordination and being able to give to all of the committees or all of the state parties. And Saul, let's dig into some nuts and bolts, because the committee, the C in the RNC, is made up of 168 members. A lot of insiders just call them the 168. Who are they and how do they get elected?
So the 168 members are elected. There's 3 members from every state, territory, as well as the District of Columbia that are elected to serve on the Republican National Committee. So you have the state chairman in each of those states, which is basically normally elected every 2 years. And they serve for a 2-year cycle or for whenever their election is done. And then there's a Republican National Committee man and a committee woman elected from each state and territory. They are normally elected in the year of a convention, but they serve the day after the current convention to the day after the next convention. So they literally serve in a 4-year term from convention to convention for the purposes of being the committee that deals with the nominating process, which is, again, one of the more important roles that the Republican National Committee plays, which is nominating the President of the United States.
So who exactly are these people? What kind of backgrounds do they have? Are they campaign experts? Are they politicians?
Yeah, there's a little bit of everything, right? The campaign chairs or the chairs of the parties tend to be more political people. They are folks who've either run campaigns, worked on campaigns, tend to be major donors or people involved in the fundraising aspect of a campaign, oftentimes former legislators and congressmen. So they tend to be more the political nuts and bolts type of folks. The National Committee man, committee woman tend to be more from the grassroots. Sometimes they are major donors or people or friends of the governor who traditionally serve as a titular head for their respective states. So oftentimes you see the National Committee man or committee woman be kind of the right hand or left hand of the sitting governor or U.S. senator. Other times they are grassroots activists who kind of work their way up through the party, are well respected across their respective states, and are kind of the workhorses that get out there and work. So you see a lot of the women who show up are from the Women's Federation or Eagle Forum or some of the other organizations that are there on the women's side. On the men's side, again, can be the same type of venue from just activist side, but also from the donor side. So virtually anybody can run. Anybody can be a state chairman. Anybody can be a national committee man or committee woman. But most of them are elected at the state level. In some cases, the state committees, which are smaller bodies that can be as little as say 19 in Illinois to 68 in Missouri, or they can be at state conventions like in Michigan, where we have over 2,000 delegates participate, or Texas, where over 15,000 delegates participate at their conventions, where they elect the leadership. But all of that is based at the state level, and each state can decide how they elect their representatives to the Republican National Committee.
Within the committee, the RNC, what sort of authority or responsibilities do those members have? We obviously know the role of the RNC broadly, but what is a member's role within the RNC?
Yeah, there's a couple. There's basically those are built around committees that are normally appointed by the chairman of the committee, other committee. So the Republican National Committee chairman will take a look at some of the issues that are affecting us at a given time. And I served, like, I was the first chairman of the technology committee when it was created, and we did the first online meeting with 6,000 activists from across the country that had never been done before. And so there's that was a special committee. But then you have an issues committee that deals with issues that are important, that are coming up where the party wants to express the will of the party. You have a budget committee that takes a look at the spending of the committee, and is it and kind of an oversight committee. You have a conventions committee that is always working almost year round, 4 years in a row, already looking at the next national convention, how to organize it, who gets to, what's going to be the next location, what nuances that we learned from the last one, and how do you change it. So the functions are traditionally more based on some standing committees and then special committees that the chairman of the Republican National Committee appoints.
So it does have some pretty serious obligations, like the convention where we legally nominate who our candidate is for president, and then there are some other responsibilities, oversight of the party and things like that. But it's not like I just sort of get frustrated anytime when I hear someone say, "Oh, the Republican Party should do this," and if I'm having a conversation with them, I say, "Well, what does that mean? What does that look like?" The RNC is not our Politburo that determines party doctrine and things like that.
That's right. And the RNC in most cases is very limited with regards to the scope of their power to state parties. So our conventions are kind of the supreme ruling body. So the national convention, when the thousands of delegates gather at the national convention, they override anything the central committee has said or anybody else. So at those conventions, we literally set the rules for the next 4 years for the party. And oftentimes they are different than the recommendations that the Republican National Committee has made. So we are a very diverse, but we're really spread out to the grassroots, where we give the states greater influence and power than we give the national committee, and it goes down. So they set parameters, but the state parties have a lot of flexibility in what to do. And then ultimately the delegates that come up from the state parties and from their various states have the ultimate power to decide, the rules, the regulations, the procedures. They can change things. If they didn't like how something was done, they could literally on the floor, propose something different and have a completely new voting process. So there's a whole lot of things that are done, and the National Committee kind of serves as that umbrella and the structure in which we have to work, but they're not that powerful. I mean, the chairman can't dictate to a state party what it can and can't do. The national committee man, committee woman, oftentimes at the state level, are influential because of their influence at the national party level, but sometimes they are not that influential at the state level. It just depends on the role they play. Other times they have a lot of respect and a lot of credibility, and so they may be more influential than others. But a state party chairman is normally the person who, they're the ones raising the money, they're the ones setting the policy, they're the ones choosing the direction of the party at the state level, working with the elected officials. So it is exponentially more powerful and more influential than the national committee people who serve kind of a more representative role to the national party versus a policy decision-making role.
You're listening to the Business of Politics show. I'm speaking with Saul Anuzis about the Republican National Committee, how it works, who's on it, and what its role is in the broader Republican Party. So we've obviously got relationships up from the states, but what, if anything, does the RNC do that goes back to the state parties?
Well, look, they have a great job at educational efforts. So they try to train campaign managers, finance people, media folks, media training. So there's a big educational aspect to it. Secondly, they have field staff. It's a political director, a regional political director, regional finance director, who specifically has professional staff that work at maybe 3 to 5 states at a time, depending on their size. And they work with the state parties to help them do their jobs better. So they're outside consultants, experts paid for by the RNC to do that. Then the RNC also engages in like specific outreach programs. So we have a fairly large minority outreach program where, actually started maybe 10, 15 years ago, where we started going into major urban areas and setting up a presence.
My old boss, Ed Gillespie, really
making it permanent rather than, just kind of coming in 6 months before an election and wondering why people aren't voting for you. We opened up brick and mortar and have brochures and have a staff person sitting there and talking to people and going to community events. And it's a slow process, but we've seen tremendous increase in support in the Latin American community and the Hispanic community. Take a look at the African American community. And those are tough nuts to crack, but they can be done, but you got to make a sustained commitment. It's, they see through kind of this, we're here 6 months ahead of time and, running some ads in Spanish. And it doesn't mean all of a sudden that, you're going to get the Hispanic vote. So there's that kind of effort that's done. They do sit on the international, there are international representatives. So right. Whether it's the IRI or IDU or other groups that are kind of center-right organizations around the country, they're around the world, there is an organization, there's a number of organizations that engage with Republicans as kind of the conservative representatives for the United States. And we have a voice there. And some are official representatives and others are just, members that get involved because they're interested in international affairs or, helping the United States have a stronger voice around the world.
Yeah, I think that's something that's important for our listeners to know, that any time, for the most part, once we're in a general election, if you see someone knocking on doors, volunteering, making phone calls, that staff person is an employee of the state party funded through the RNC. They lead just an absolutely enormous field operation with boots on the ground, and they've really ramped that up over the last couple of years.
And the other thing that probably is just as important is election integrity. We have thousands of lawyers that volunteer to work on election day and the day before and the day after to make sure that everything is done legally and we don't have some of these issues that keep popping up around the country these days. But as we clean up the state laws, as we make the procedures and the process more straightforward and understandable, the lawyers are still there to interpret it because, people are trying to game the system to their advantage. And, we've seen that in the last couple of cycles with the Democrats, arguably rigging the election to taking every advantage they can to benefit their side, while most of those activities were not illegal, but they were clearly kind of unethical and not what was normally done. So, those are the challenges that we have, and an organization like the Republican National Committee is in the best position to do that and to make sure that the laws are equally applied across the country.
Saul, we're in the middle of a RNC chair's race, which has appearances of being contentious, if not competitive. You've run for RNC chair before. What is that process like, and how are members making their decision?
Well, it's really an inside baseball game. I mean, the 168 members are the only members that vote. We discussed how they're elected, so they have a tremendous amount of flexibility in the sense that, they're accountable once every 4 years to an audience that may or may not remember a chairman's race, which has never been really that sexy of a thing to pay attention to.
Right.
So it's truly inside baseball. The expectation is, and most candidates who are running travel to each and every state, meet with the 3 members in their home states, sometimes together, sometimes individually, depending on their personalities and their styles. They talk about the resources and the help the state party has gotten from the RNC. What can they expect if a new chairman or the same chairman is reelected? It is your best opportunity to raise your concerns, et cetera. But at the same time, it's all about relationships. The idea of beating an incumbent is extremely difficult. If Ronald McDaniels has done a good job in working with the members and making them feel comfortable and taking care of their issues and taking care of their states and making sure that they're happy with regards to the things that they get involved in at the Republican national level, it is extremely difficult to beat her. But at the same time, this is the first time in the history of the RNC that I've ever seen where you've got first she's running for a historical third term at a time that has never happened before. But secondly, they're also having state parties have no confidence votes. State parties and executive committees actually say we want change. And so the people who are electing the national committee people, the people who actually elect the national committee chairs or state chairmen, are actually expressing their opinions in a way that is very unique from the history of our races. And so in the past, you kind of had this mass grassroots reaction one way or the other. I like this candidate, I like that candidate, but it was just noise because it wasn't really directed at the people who, the 168 that make the decision. This time around, it's a very unique process that we've never witnessed. And so there's, Harmeet Dillon is the national committee woman from California. She's also the head of the Republican Lawyers Association. So she's got a lot of credibility. She's been, very vocal on the news. She's oftentimes speaks, on national television. So she has a higher profile than most candidates who are running. And she's actually making a race of this. But it's still an uphill battle. It's still a very difficult battle. The odds are probably fairly high that Rana is reelected. But for the first time in a long time, you have an incumbent being challenged in a way that has not been traditionally seen. I'd say it's Rana's to lose, but at the same time, this is a very unique situation.
Yeah, it certainly has led to making a lot of noise. But I think you're right that the current chair is in a very strong position to win re-election. And certainly she has already the public support of a majority of the committee. So a lot of sound and fury, unclear what that translates. But it does portend to something that is, evolving in our party structure, right? Where people are paying more attention to what was previously inside baseball. Aside from the sort of strategy, I'm curious to hear what's one thing you would change about how the RNC works, maybe in its relationships with candidates or parties or even with its members.
Well, that's a tough question with regards to what one thing would you change? The key is that, we are a bottom-up party. So I think that whenever the national party or national leader tries to, kind of project their will by force on everybody else, it normally backfires. Given the age of the internet, social media, technology, changing election laws, we're finding it easier and easier to work outside the party structure. Right. So all of a sudden, you're seeing independent committees that are being formed. You're seeing interest groups create their own operations. You're seeing, whether it's the NRA, whether it's a group like 60 Plus that I represent, whether it's the Tea Party, whether it's, 100 different groups that are out there organizing activists, pushing for issues that they believe in, and trying to have an influence in the process. There's a huge thrust to go around the party that don't want to get locked into kind of what the establishment is saying. And so what the party has to be careful of is not to become that quintessential establishment unit that nobody pays attention to. Right. And the only way to do that is to be kind of an honest broker and to facilitate the process rather than try to dictate the process. Somebody's got to be the referee. Somebody's got to kind of lay the groundwork in. And I think that's probably the greatest role the party plays. But, each party is using different types of techniques that they're doing. How they nominate their candidates, how they put their candidates forward, what is the best way to do that, what happens when we have extremists, whether it's on the right from the Republican side or the left from the Democratic side, is there a way to pick better candidates, broader supported candidates, et cetera. So you see a lot of structural reforms taking place around the country. People are talking about, Final Five voting that was just passed in Nevada. Alaska used a variation of that for Final Four. Then they created, people to do that, kind of came up with ranked choice voting aspects so you can rank your candidates where you think they fall and have a first and second and third and fourth choice and come up with a consensus to get someone at 50% plus one. You've got a group talking about a national popular vote to basically make sure that every voter in every state's politically relevant, rather than having the 4 to 6 to 8 to 10 maybe battleground states decide who the president of the United States is. So we're talking a whole lot of structural reforms, many of which are taking place and being implemented and pushed outside the party structure because the party structure doesn't necessarily want reform. They like the system the way it is. They want to be the party bosses. So you're finding a lot of independent work kind of on the outside that is forcing the party's hand and forcing the establishment's hand to take a look at reforms that are really reflective of what the voters want and what the activists want with regards to, the candidates they elect and the policies they implement.
I agree with you definitely that the internet and technology have completely shaken up the way our institutions run, full stop, whether that's religion, culture, entertainment, politics. I think the other underappreciated aspect of this is McCain-Feingold finance reform that did a lot to weaken the official political parties by opening up the path to Citizens United and super PACs and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, look, the first time the parties and the candidates spent $1 billion on the campaign was, I think, 2012 was the first election that formally recorded $1 billion. But at the time, the estimate was that another $4 to $6 billion were spent on the outside, supporting third-party groups, get out the vote efforts, et cetera, to support respective candidates of different parties for the presidency. This time around, we're looking at, this last election, that there was probably close to $40 billion spent in the presidential election, and 90% of which was not reported or recorded or followed with regards to where they went. So, you've got guys like George Soros on the left and Michael Bloomberg who are literally writing $100 million checks or multi-$100 million checks to different groups that are, getting out the vote in their areas or activating a certain constituency that they know is pro-democratic. You've got some Republican groups that do the similar type of thing, but they're nowhere near the size that the liberal groups tend to be. Or you got Zuckerbucks coming in from, Facebook, where they went out and helped, kind of municipalities run their elections. Well, it was kind of interesting that overwhelming majority of that money went to far left Democratic leaning constituencies. They were trying to, maximize the votes from left wing groups. And so that's why a lot of people talk about, it might have been legal, but it was clearly rigged in the advantage of the Democrats. And so, you've got to understand how the process works. I think that the political process is becoming much more entrepreneurial by definition. There's a lot of people who are saying, hey, if 5 of us are willing to put in $100,000 each or $1 million each or even $10 million each, we can have a much bigger impact and drive the direction of an election rather than give to a party and let the state, a state party or a national party kind of redirect those monies. So I think there's a lot of, young entrepreneurs, business people who want to be more independent, want to have a more independent path, are looking for different groups that they agree with and would be more likely to push their issues. And so, whether it's a senior citizen group like ours or the NRA or cryptocurrency groups, or, you name 1,000 of them out there, I think you're going to see a more entrepreneurial approach to politics over time anyways, which I basically think is a healthy thing.
Let's keep looking to the future. And as we wrap up here, what do you see as the evolving role of the political party structure? What does the RNC look like 20 years from now?
I think in general, the political parties will slowly become less and less relevant in the process. I think that there are a lot of concerns by people with regards to the extremes in either party, and there's not a whole lot of way to get around it because of the way the rules are set. And so, some of these structural reforms we were talking about, I think are going to slowly emerge around the country. I think you're going to see more and more independent groups get involved in a greater way. And so I think the party over time, again, will be more and more just the referee and less the kind of 800-pound gorilla in the room that can kind of drive or direct how things go. So I think the party will be relevant. I don't think it's going away. There may be multiple parties down the line, but that will be more reflective of, kind of the structural reforms that take place. And I think you'll see a lot more people going to state level reforms and state level ways of nominating and electing their candidates, kind of like what Alaska did or others. And so I think that's just going to change both the strength and the power of parties across the country.
Well, I want to thank Saul Anuzis for a great conversation today. You can learn more about him at his website, which is in our show notes. If this episode made you a little bit smarter or gave you something to think about, or maybe you learned something brand new about the RNC, all we ask is that you share it with a friend or colleague. And then bonus, you also look smart in that process as well. So remember to subscribe to the Business of Politics show wherever you listen to podcasts so that you never miss an episode. You can also sign up for email updates on our website at businessofpoliticspodcast.com. With that, I'll say thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.